Good day and welcome to another episode of this program. Thank you very much for always making it a date to learn God's Word. So, in the last episode, I spoke about bridging gaps to understanding the Bible. So, there are gaps that may hinder us from getting the very best from the Bible, and I spoke about that time gap, gap of culture, gap of geography, language gap, and a whole host of them. If you missed it, I encourage you to catch up on YouTube, Tennis Television, on Facebook, Tennis Television, and all the other social media platforms. Of course, our website remains tenet.tv. I want to continue in this trend of thought by continuing to talk about gaps and things that may hinder us from having a full understanding of the Bible and how we can make the best of bridging these gaps. So today I'm continuing by talking about this. And the first thing I want to say is the fact that if you have ever made an attempt to read the Bible, you will see that there are repetitions in the Bible, and this could be confusing. There are things that are repeated, and if you are not careful, if you are not a good student of the Bible, you may want to give up or it may confuse you. But God is not confused, and the reason why there is repetition is because of emphasis. Anytime you see something being repeated, is because there is emphasis and it's important to get it right. So a good example are the synoptic gospels. They are called synoptic gospels because they look alike. They are looking at the same. You can actually see it as being one image being painted from different perspectives, or being seen from different lenses. And when I talk about the synoptic gospels, I'm talking of the books that are titled Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are written by the people who are named, the books are named after. So these books talk about the story of the life of Jesus, and they essentially talk about the same. Most of the stories talk about the encounter of Jesus, the experiences of Jesus, the preachings of Jesus, but they are slightly different because they look at the life and teachings of Jesus from different perspectives. Obviously, the audience is also different. The audience is different, so we expect that the language, the approach, the authors are different. So if you look at Matthew, for instance, Matthew's audience were Jews. So Matthew's concern and his aim was to position Jesus as the King of the Jews. He was writing to show and to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. If you look at Mark, Mark was positioning Jesus as a chief and humble servant. So if you look at it, you find out that Mark speaks a lot about the suffering of Jesus, and he encourages Christians to go through persecution as the price that we have to pay for following Jesus. Luke, positioned Jesus as the Son of Man, or as a real human being. So we know that Jesus left his glory in heaven and he came as a human being. So Luke spoke about, Jesus being a real human being. He was sorrowful at times. He was tired at times. He was hungry at times. So, and this is because of the audience that he was writing to. The one that is slightly different from the rest of them, which is less of narrative and more of the teachings, is the Gospel of John. And this is particularly aimed at believers. And John was writing to say Jesus is God incarnate. So he's emphasizing the divinity of Jesus. So if you don't read with these backgrounds in mind, it's a lot easier for you to get confused. If you look at some of the parables that Jesus told, apparently he told them sometimes multiple times, you see that they are repeated in these books, and the emphasis for each of them is different. So it's important that we know the background to each of these books. In the last episode, I encouraged that you read the Bible in a systematic manner and that you must read one book at a time. Obviously, there are other ways to read. You can study the Bible by topic, you can study the Bible by biography, but it's a lot easier for someone who's just starting to start book by book. And I encourage you to take advantage of study materials. The best study material is the Bible itself, and a study Bible has additional materials like all this explanation I'm giving you. You can find it in a study Bible. A study Bible will tell you all this background information before every book is written, and even in the course of the book you will get further information. Now, in terms of repetition, you find out that some books look alike and you are wondering what is the difference. For example, the book of Chronicles, which is First Chronicles, Second Chronicles, and the book of Kings, you'll find out that you see stories that you read in Chronicles also appearing in the book of Kings. In fact, you wonder, why do we need this repetition? You need it because you need different perspectives. Just like I said before, we need 4 Gospels to show the various perspectives of Jesus. So in terms of Chronicles, just to say by the way, First Chronicle and Second Chronicles were originally one book. But when the Bible was being compiled, they felt, oh, it's going to be too large, let's break it. Also, First Kings and Second Kings were originally one book. Now, what's the difference between Chronicles and Kings? As you would know, after Israel sinned against God, after a lot of warning, they were taken captive. The northern kingdom was taken captive by Assyria, and the southern kingdom, which was Judah, was taken captive by Babylon. Now, when they returned, that was when the book of Chronicles was written. And the book of Chronicles was written by a priest. The book of Kings was written by a prophet. So you find out that the book of Kings was focusing more on the negative, because the book of Kings was written before they were taken exile. So when he's talking about the history of the kings, he's emphasizing the negative things they did, because he was warning them that if you don't change, you are going to be taken into captivity. The book of Chronicles was after all the exile has happened, and then they came back. And when they came back, they needed to find their bearing. They needed to understand their roots, and that's why First Chronicles starts by the first 8 chapters thereabout was about names. So if you are reading it could be boring, and you say, what is all these names for? The name is there because they needed to understand their roots, they needed to understand the religion, and a number of other things. Of course, they needed to take pride in their national identity. So it's important to understand these backgrounds. Again, I emphasize the way to understand the background is by virtue of helps and materials. And in the separate episode, I'm going to be talking about what materials are available. The other principle I also want to mention is the fact that to understand a part, sometimes you need to understand the whole. You see, the Bible is one story that is woven together. It's one story about God, and like someone said, it started in a garden and it ends in a city, and God is the author throughout. So sometimes to understand the one book, you need to understand the whole picture. And the way I imagine it is, in these days of drone, you can imagine a drone showing you an area picture, let's say of a campus, and then you can zoom in onto one block, and maybe you can now go into one room. The drone and the area picture being the story of the Bible itself. And if you don't understand the global picture, it may be difficult for you to actually understand the individual stories of the books. And I'm going to give you some examples. For instance, if we are talking about the book of Ezra, the book of Nehemiah, the book of Esther, Haggai, and Zechariah, what do they have in common? Again, you need to understand the whole before you know how the various parts fit together. Now, what all these books have in common is the fact that they have something to do with the captivity, the exile of the Israelites. So Ezra, for instance, was the one that, when the king of Babylon said, you guys can go back to your country and rebuild, he was the teacher that discovered the book of the law and taught the people. Uh, Later on, Nehemiah came and he helped to build the wall. When Ezra was starting, they were building the temple. Esther, of course, the story of Esther happened in the captivity, and Haggai and Zechariah were the prophets who ministered and encouraged people who were building the wall and the temple at various times. What do I mean by saying to understand the whole, the part, you need to understand the whole? Now, all of these books cannot be read in isolation. So if you are reading Zechariah, he was a prophet, he was prophesying, you need to have in mind the story of the captivity and the return and the building. So you need to bear in mind Ezra and Nehemiah building. Okay, so like I said, you need to understand all the connections. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. If you want to fix a jigsaw puzzle, you need to know what is the picture that the jigsaw puzzle is about. So when you have a small part, you know where to put it. If you look at the book of Judges, Kings, Joshua, what is the relationship? You know, after Moses died, you find out that Joshua was the one that took over. And you find out that subsequently, you know, it was an era of judges, and then they said they wanted kings. So it's important to understand how these books fit together and not just read them in isolation. The other point I also want to make that I think is going to help you in understanding the Bible and gleaning truth from it is the fact that you must look for what I call virtual partitions, or you must be able to see when there is a shift. For instance, in the book of Acts of the Apostles, you'll find out that the first 12 chapters kept talking about Peter. I mean, Peter was the dominant figure in the first 12 chapters of the book of Acts. Obviously, he was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. But from chapter 12 to 28 in the book of Acts, you find out that there is a shift. Now, they wouldn't write it there and say, oh, there is a partition now. They wouldn't tell you, now we are going to be talking about Paul. But you just see that there is a lot more mentioning of Paul. He became the key figure. And if you're a Bible student, you notice that God had spoken to Peter in a vision saying, arise, eat, kill and eat. And Peter was like, no, I'm not going to do that. So Peter was too Jewish in his mind, and because of that, he lost the opportunity. He was the one that God wanted to be the apostle to the Gentiles. That is, people who are outside the Jews. So he would have had an international ministry, but because his mind was closed. So you need to be able to see these shifts that are not necessarily clear, mentioned, but it's obvious. If you look at the book of Joshua also, again, I told you, Joshua was one that took over from Moses, and he was a military commander, unlike Moses, who was more of a spiritual leader. But you find out that the first 11 chapters of Joshua is clearly different from the remaining part, 11 to the end. The first 11 verses were talking about wars and conquest and winning. But subsequently, they needed to distribute. So the first 11 chapters were about, you can call it the book of wars, and then the remaining part, 11 to the end, were more of the book of distribution. Again, this will have to do with your observation to see that, oh, something has changed, something has shifted. Just like if you are a good Bible student, you notice that in the Old Testament, the emphasis was more on the negative. Don't do this, don't do this. But if you look at the New Testament, it's more about what you should be. If you are a child of God, this is what you should do. So the emphasis is more on do this, because if you do the right things, like the book of Ephesians talk a lot about the position of the believer, you will find out that you don't need to focus on the negative. All right. So having said that, it's important to note that the books of the Bible were written in different styles. We can say there are different genres, to use a musical term, of the books. So the books have been classified, but much more importantly, there are books that are written in prose, like history book, written like a novel. The first 5 books, for instance, are history books, talking about the history of Israel. Of course, a lot more, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, Kings, and all those ones. They are history books. And in those ones, you can read it like a novel, reading one segment at a time, understanding who is a key figure, what is the main lesson, what are the challenges there. But if you find out that, there are other books like the Gospels, there are prophets, there are letters, there are poetry books. The way you read a poetry book is different from the way you read a history book. That's what I'm saying. So poetry books are books like Proverbs, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, which is called Song of Solomon, because originally they are written to be sung. Psalms was written to be sung. Most of Psalms are songs, and in some cases prayers. But Proverbs, for instance, I will not recommend that you read the whole 31 chapters of the book of Proverbs at a go. Or I will not even recommend that you read 3 chapters of Proverbs at a time. Proverbs is better read perhaps 1 chapter in a day. Or better still, a few verses of Proverbs at a time. Because if you read it like, let's say, 10, 20 chapters, it's too much of nugget, because Proverbs is wisdom that is crafted in small sentences. So if you read 3 chapters and you have 20 nuggets there, it's very difficult for you to dwell on it. But if you read 3 chapters and meditate on, 3 verses and meditate on it, then you will stick. It will stick. It will stay with you. You can even meditate on it. Some have recommended that you read just 1 chapter of Proverbs in a day, and then you will cover it. It's like you have enough wisdom for every month. So the way you read a poetry book is different from the way you will read a prose or a gospel. I've spoken a lot about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are the Gospels. Okay, so you also find out that the poetry books are written with some styles. You can imagine the book of Job, for instance. It could be difficult to understand if you don't understand and read it from a theater. You read it, it's for me, it looks like a Shakespeare play. One character comes to the stage, does his own part, speaks all his part, then he goes to the back, and then another one steps in front. That was the setting of the book of Job. Job had a challenge, and he had 3 friends, and per time each of them was talking. So if you don't understand how to juxtapose and say, okay, now Job has finished speaking, it is now Eliphaz, or Bildad that is talking, you will get confused. Okay, so as I begin to bring this to a close, I want you to know that there are questions that you need to ask if you must be a good Bible student. Irrespective of which type of book you are reading, you need to ask questions, and these are the questions that I want to conclude today's broadcast with. Number 1, you need to ask yourself, what exactly is the point of this passage? What is this saying? What is it saying, not even to me, but what does it mean to the original readers of the Bible before I even start to put it into practice? Who is talking? It's important to know who is talking. A lot of people have made mistakes by quoting things out of context. And you need to be careful, because some people have quoted what somebody who is probably in a backsliding state, or somebody who is not correct. Like Solomon has a lot of negative things to say about women, and it's because, if you have married 1,000 women, there is no way you can have respect for women. So he will just say certain things. So you cannot take that as gospel. If it's not God who is saying it, or Jesus, you need to watch it. So it's important to know who is talking. Who is this addressed to? What are the events surrounding this? And sometimes you see a verse that is occurring. Say, where is this verse occurring other than this? As you read your Bible, you find out that you see certain scriptures that are quoted elsewhere. For instance, when the devil tempted Jesus, let's say in Matthew chapter 4, you find out that Jesus said, it is written. So if you're a good Bible student, you say, it is written. Where is it? You need to go check. And if you are a good student, you find out that it was actually quoting from Deuteronomy. Of course, if you have a good study Bible, there will be a footnote that tell you where that scripture is occurring. What is the verse not saying? It's important to know what is said and what is not said. It's also important to know what is implied and not necessarily said. Who is the audience? What are the problems in the passage? What are the lessons for me? Are there warnings for me? Those are the things that you need to ask yourself. And this is the way that you can be a good Bible student. If you need any help with more questions or more hints, background materials on how to read the Bible, and we are posting on our Facebook page videos, short videos that are introductory messages to each of the books of the Bible. I encourage you to check it out. Until next time, when I come your way, keep being a good Bible student. God bless.